Well, hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message again this week. Nancy and I were at the Duluth Mall a few weeks ago, and I found a pair of shoes at J.C. Penney marked down from $100 to $13. I bought 11 pair of them, and I'm storing them in a new barn that I built over the past few weeks. That won't make any sense to those of you that didn't see the message or hear the message from a couple of weeks ago, but you can check that out. Seriously, when I took my pair of shoes to the register, I couldn't find my wallet. I looked in my coat, a back pocket of my pants, everywhere on my person, and it was gone. Nancy rushed back to the food court where we had just eaten to see if maybe it was still there. I quickly went back to the shoe department. Nothing. I felt like sick to my stomach, and I started to think in a half panic about, okay, I got to call to cancel a couple of credit cards and to put a hold on a debit card that I carry in my wallet. Worse than feeling like helpless, there was this thought that eventually came to me. What if my wallet, since we were only 10 miles from Superior, Wisconsin, what if my wallet got found by a Green Bay Packers fan who ended up turning it in, and then I would get it back and I would feel obligated to be grateful to a cheesehead? That was the most horrifying thought of all. Here was my dilemma, actually. I knew that the only places that my wallet could have been were in the chair next to me as we were eating not more than about 30 minutes earlier at the food court, or by the bench in the shoe department when I had tried on the shoes. I knew exactly where my wallet could have ended up. Those two places, only those two places. But I couldn't find it. Fortunately, Nancy stopped at the mall office and some honest people had turned it in, and I didn't even have to thank anybody from Wisconsin. If my wallet had feelings, it would have been so relieved to get back to me as the owner. Now, we've all lost things, and we all have been lost at different times in our lives. Maybe this can relate to you because you've lost something valuable yourself. Your car keys would be one example, or I think more and more these days people get in a panic when they can't find their phones for an extended period of time. So maybe you can relate to the feelings about losing something important, or maybe you could relate to my wallet's imaginary feelings because you have felt kind of adrift yourself at times. And I am actually serious about that last part, about feeling adrift and my wallet's imaginary feelings. I think these past 3+ years now with COVID and with racial unrest and with political realities and with economic uncertainty, it has caused people more perhaps than any other time before, at least during our lifetimes, to feel like they're a little bit lost, feeling untethered perhaps, feeling maybe even abandoned sometimes, feeling overlooked, feeling like totally incapable of getting the crazy to stop, feeling kind of lost in some of the most familiar places. Even Jesus followers, long-term believers, I've had conversations with them, and I sense periodically that they have this feeling of feeling lost and disoriented and wondering, where's this all going? And are we on this slippery slope that just keeps getting faster and faster, and to the point where we can't adapt to it as quickly as we would like? And as Christ followers, we're still going and doing the same things. We come to worship and we sing with all of our heart. We're reading our Bibles. We are praying. We are following. We are worshiping. We are oftentimes still serving. And all the time, feeling somewhat less connected. Feeling maybe not well connected at all to God. And that is not unusual when our faith has to deal with new realities that seem to be rapidly evolving. This is when Christians, I think, can be so susceptible to the doubts and to the accusations that the devil puts in our minds. Do you really think that God cares? Do you really think he's listening to your prayers? Because none of them seem to be getting answered. Do you really think he even knows where you're at? Do you really think you're important to him? Is this how an all-loving God should make you feel? Over the last 3 years, while I have been able to, for the most part, keep these thoughts at bay and keep them under control, I have definitely felt that life seems more and more untethered. I felt that way even this year. But so I don't forget, let me remind you, and I would need to remind myself as well, of two very important realities. First, feelings are notoriously untrustworthy. And second, truth doesn't change, and God's promises don't break down. Now, I know we can go to Scripture, and there are numerous promises, and I could remind you of several of them, such as God promising his people that he will never leave us, he will never forsake us. But today I want to look at a story. Since we're looking at during the season of Lent, since we're looking at the last teaching, some of the last teachings of Jesus, I want to look at some principles from a story that my guess is most of us have overlooked because it's not one of Jesus's most well-known stories. In Luke chapter 15, right away at the beginning of the chapter, we find that that there are people who are gathering around Jesus, and they're the traditional people who were hanging out with him, tax collectors, who'd been rejected by society because they were traitors to Rome. Sinners is what Luke 15 refers to them as, but likely includes prostitutes who were selling their bodies, maybe selling out in a different way than what the tax collectors were selling out to Rome. And certainly in the crowd of people, there had been many sick people who were unclean, hoping that there would be a healing session that would come up for Jesus. And as usual, when Jesus is interacting with these type of people, the Pharisees are probably present as well, and they're looking and they're going, Jesus, if you only knew what those type of people are doing. Nobody who's respectable hangs out among people at the margins of society like that. And that's when Jesus chooses to tell 3 stories, 3 parables of lost things that are told to lost people. The first story, we're really familiar with it. It's the story of the shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one of them wanders away, and that shepherd leaves 99 sheep behind, we are told in Luke 15, verse 4, leaves them behind in the open country. You know what that tells you? That means that they're unprotected, they're vulnerable, they're at risk. And the one sheep is so valuable that he goes out to try to find that sheep. Takes him quite an effort, perhaps. Probably does so at night. All right? And that sheep that he's looking after, if the sheep have feelings, is feeling lost and is feeling vulnerable and undoubtedly is consumed with fear. There have to be predators that can't be real far away. I love that story. You probably love that story as well. I've preached on that story. You've probably heard messages on it. The third story is the parable of the lost son, who squanders his dad's inheritance and ends up in a pig pen. We call it the story of the prodigal son. And he realizes when he is in the pig pen that found servants who are still working on his dad's farm lived better than lost sons who were far away from home. And so he goes home in humility, and his dad restores him, just an unbelievable picture and image of grace and the love of God. This is probably the favorite story of most Christians and the favorite Jesus story for even non-Christians. Tucked between those 2 stories, though, of things that have wandered away, a sheep that wanders away and a son that wanders away, willfully wandering away, purposely leaving behind the voice of the shepherd, purposely leaving behind the love of a father, and finding both of themselves vulnerable and in dire circumstances, living nowhere near the way that they should be able to live. Tucked between those 2 stories is the shortest of the 3 stories of something that is lost, and one that I don't think I've ever heard a message on. I know I've never preached on it. This is it. The story or the parable of the lost coin. 3 short verses, and actually the story itself is told in just 2. Or suppose, Jesus says, a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Notice it's not the thing going out that's getting lost. It's the owner who loses one, okay? Does she not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, She calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So clearly, one point I want to make here right from the very start is, yes, Jesus is talking about, are using this story and talking about people that are lost and are estranged from Him and really aren't found by Him in a salvation type sense. Okay, I get that, all right? But sometimes Jesus' stories can have multiple applications to them, and I'm going to focus on a different one today that might be more relevant for those of us who follow Him. As I said before, this is one of Jesus' shortest parables. And it's not looked on, and it doesn't draw a lot of attention to it because it's not one of the more dramatic ones. It involves not something lost that is living, like a sheep or a coin, or a sheep or a son, but it involves something that is lost that is non-living. It's a coin. It's valuable, certainly, but it's an object that has no life. It has no will. It has no ability to rebel. It has no spirit. It has no feelings. So this woman has 10 silver coins, okay, called drachmas, all right? These were Greek coins, not Roman coins. Similar worth to a Roman denarius, but much, much older. The Greek world had coins called drachmas going back at least 500 years before Jesus Christ. But it was in similar value to a Roman denarius, which was about a day's wages, all right? So she has saved up, this lady, she has saved up 2 weeks' wages, okay? 5 working days a week, by our standards, working days a week, okay? So maybe $1,000 in today's value, $1,500, okay, is what she has saved up, and she's lost one of those coins. This is not insignificant loss. No, there are a couple things that are different about this compared to the other stories that surface that are like right away, okay? The first is the lost item here doesn't get lost on its own, as I already said when I was reading it. Okay, and the second thing is this. The owner knows exactly the location where it is lost. And it's not lost at the market. It's not lost at the well. It's not lost in her yard. It's not lost on the way from her house to her sister's house. She knows that this coin is lost in her house. That was the last place she had it. She almost certainly didn't leave the house with it. This is a lot of money. Somehow that coin got lost right where it was. And the woman knows exactly where to look. Maybe it should be renamed the parable of the misplaced coin or the unlocated coin. I wonder if Jesus tells this story for our primary benefit as Christ followers. Between two stories of things that willfully go out and get lost, there is the story of something that gets lost, not of its own will, but something that might feel lost if indeed it did have feelings. We haven't wandered away, many of us, like a dumb sheep. We haven't purposely traveled far from God like the lost son story seems to indicate. No, you haven't gone anywhere. You're still connected to faith. That's why you're watching this message online, I assume. You're still connected to your community. Some of you are connected and regularly still meeting with a small group of believers that are challenging you in your faith and praying with you and caring about your needs. You still perhaps are able to come to worship most Sundays. And yet there's this periodical feeling that something's a bit off. And sometimes that feeling lasts a long time. So let me assure you of something. Like that woman who knows that her coin is somewhere in the house, God knows that you haven't strayed away from Him. It's common to feel lost or disoriented when in reality, that's not at all what God knows to be true about you. Losing the value of this coin isn't a minor thing. It's not like dropping a nickel when you've been given change. This lady can't track down the equivalent of a $100 bill. If you lost a $100 bill, my guess is you'd be looking for it as well. So it represents a lot of things to her, and she does 3 things in this story that probably have more meaning to them than they might appear to us at first glance. The first is this. We're told in verse 8 that she lights a lamp. Okay? Certainly an oil lamp, meaning that she almost certainly discovered that the coin was missing when there wasn't a lot of natural light available in the house. If the lady finds that coin, or if the lady finds that the coin is lost, at like 10 o'clock in the morning or at high noon, you know what you would do? You would pull back the curtains, you would open the door, you would let in as much natural light as there could be, and then you would use that natural light to track it down in the house. But in the evening, just before bedtime, if that's when you found that the coin was lost, and you wanted to look for it right then, you'd light a lamp. And she does that right away, immediately. She doesn't think, well, it can't be far and it will eventually show up. Why waste oil looking for it tonight when I'll likely discover it in the morning anyways? And she also doesn't think, well, 9 coins is still a lot. Probably find it eventually. I'm not that concerned about it. No, think about it. This is a priority that has her searching for it as soon as she realizes that it's gone missing. Don't overlook that, and don't overlook the reality that in a story like this woman represents how God looks for lost people. Even those who are lost, really close to where he is, or those who are feeling lost, very close to where he is. The valuable coin here is representative of a lost person. So can I make a suggestion to you? If the coin could think, if the coin had feelings, like if my lost wallet had feelings, the coin's experience would be that I'm lost, and I know I'm lost, and I cannot be certain that anyone is looking for me until I get found. It would be totally inaccurate for the coin to be convinced that it is unmissed, that it is unvaluable, that the owner isn't looking for it, or that it will never be found. And yet, in similar circumstances, people, including Christ followers, we come to those types of conclusions all the time when life feels somewhat untethered. When we don't sense God's presence near us, even though he's right in the same room. We just can't sense it. The imagery from this short phrase that she lights a lamp is very clear. People who feel lost remain of utmost priority for the God to whom we belong. Yes, it may be the woman's bedtime, but the lost coin takes precedence even over her sleep after probably an exhausting day, which most days for women back in those days probably were quite exhausting. So that's the first thing she does. She lights a lamp. And the second thing that she does is she sweeps the house. Okay? Now, when I say sweep the house, some of you can't relate to that because you have a Roomba, which we have, and we rarely have to sweep the kitchen any longer because we have a dog that sheds a lot. And when we got the dog, I determined we're going to spend the money to get something that will take care of the dog here in the kitchen and in the dining room every single day so that Nancy doesn't have to do it and so that I don't have to feel guilty about Nancy doing it. All right, so we don't sweep as much as we used to. And also, when you hear this phrase, she sweeps the house, you're probably immediately thinking of how we sweep a house. Well, let me fill you in on something that's a little bit different to you because how Scripture gets interpreted depends on the cultural background of the readers of the audience. And for centuries, especially in underdeveloped countries, for centuries, people reading this story would have had an image totally different than what we have of an image that relates to sweeping the house. I'm going to explain to you how people in many African cultures would understand this phrase because Nancy and I had the privilege of living and ministering in Africa for 11 years. Because their sweeping, even right up to today, I'm sure, especially in the village areas and all, their sweeping would likely be very similar to sweeping from 2,000 years ago. And here's the reality. Traditional brooms in Africa didn't have long handles. You didn't have a wooden handle that was 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet long. All right? No, their brooms were hard, long grasses with the same type of straw type thing that we have and all. And what they would take is they would take a fistful of these, probably about this big around, and they would be about maybe 20 inches long, and then they would tie some leather or something around one end of it and all, and it would be a short-handled broom. And that would be all bound together, and sweeping is not done standing up. Sweeping is done leaning over. And it's a much more tiring task, which is why we don't have brooms that look like those. Sweeping is done close to the ground. Sweeping is hard work. Sweeping is perhaps more personally engaging for them because they're right close to where the floor is. Also because of the dust. African houses, at least, were swept every single day, particularly out in the villages. In fact, their yards, which generally were just smooth, hard dirt and rarely had grass on them, those yards would get swept every day too because, well, it's rural for most of them, and chickens. And what chickens leave behind, you connect the dots. If you lived with a chicken in your yard all the time, guess what? You would sweep the yard every single day, perhaps more than once a day. Furthermore, virtually every African woman that we know would find it very interesting that the woman herself sweeps the house. That's a chore for young girls with stronger young backs, not a chore for an older woman. The search for the lost coin is immediate. It doesn't matter that the house was already swept earlier in the day and would be routinely swept the next morning as the first order of business for a woman when she gets up. And the task, as an African woman or an African person would read this story, the task is not delegated to a young person to perform, a subordinate. A girl isn't going to do this. No, the owner decides, I'm sweeping myself. That's how important that coin is. I'm going to get personally involved in sweeping. I've done it numerous times in the past. In my younger years, I'm doing it now because that coin has incredible value to me. It's more important than we might think just based on our understanding of culture and sweeping. Seriously, I think most listeners from an ancient culture would have thought how great that the coin is being looked for by the owner herself, and it's being looked for immediately in spite of extra physical effort. At night, with a lamp on, because it cannot wait until the morning. And then the third thing that the woman does is she searches carefully. The word for carefully here, actually there's two words, searches and carefully, two different words in the Greek language. But the word for carefully means to search diligently and to search thoroughly. It includes the sense of searching with anxiety or searching with concern. It's actually related to 1 Peter 5, verse 7, which is a favorite verse for so many of us, a promise that is a good one to keep in mind, casting all your cares on him because he cares for you, which I've always thought for years a better rendering of that might be casting all your care on him because he does the caring for us. He does the caring in place of us. The first word for care in this verse in 1 Peter, casting all your care, it actually means to cast all your worries, to cast all your split-mindedness, your double-mindedness, okay? It's the second word for cares, though, that is actually the same word as in Luke 15. Taking an interest in and being concerned for our well-being. It is not too inaccurate to imagine that Jesus is saying that our sense of lostness concerns him so much, or our feelings of being lost concern him so much that his heart peace isn't full until our heart peace returns, until we are connected fully to him. He ties his well-being to our well-being. Our value isn't fully realized until we are in close connection with him. My dad often told the story going back to the 1960s when we lived in Cottage Grove, and he tells the story of how he was offered 4 tickets through a salesman at the job where he worked and all to go to a Minnesota Twins game, which was acceptable in his business. And so he took me and my 2 older brothers to the Twins game, and it was at the old Met Stadium with a large parking lot outside, and Dad thought, or thinks, or used to think that I was about 5 years old when this took place. And after the game, we're headed out of the stadium, and somehow I got separated from him in the parking lot with thousands of cars around. Dad remembered being so worried about this Even though, back in the late 1960s, child disappearances were extremely uncommon. A lost child was in very little danger. Some responsible adults with morals and values and good boundaries and all would grab the child's hand and take the child to an authority, a policeman or whatever, until the connection could be made with the parents. And that just happened in our culture back in the days. These days, parents would be in like utter panic to have a lost child in a massive parking lot with a bunch of cars that were easy to just grab the child and put them directly into the car and off you go without any security cameras to record what was happening. So Dad was really worried, but he didn't know what to do. And eventually he decided to go to the car, and he found, when he got to the car, that I was already there. Apparently, totally unworried, unbothered, perhaps confused why it took him and my two older brothers so long to find the car when I was able to find it more quickly than they did. Here's my point. The way my dad would tell the story makes it clear he was way more worried than I appeared to be. His concern for my well-being was far greater than my own awareness of not being with him. In fact, what's interesting to me is I do have some memories from when I was 5 years old. I don't remember that incident at all. And you would think that if it was really traumatic to me, it would stick out as like one of my first horrible memories. I think God is the same way as my dad was. His concern for us is so much greater than our worries or fears or awareness of our situation. And then briefly, there's one last part to this story that I'll focus on, and we'll wrap this up. Notice that the woman searches anxiously until she finds it. God is not giving up. He is not going to stop pursuing us. He is not going to stop wanting us to get to a place where we know He is by our side, when we feel stable again, when we are free of the feelings of abandonment or lostness or being untethered. Can I just encourage you, a time is definitely coming when you will sense His strong presence again. So the feelings that come up, feeling lost, feeling disconnected, wondering if or when God is going to manifest His presence to us again, those are not uncommon, nor are they ungodly feelings. They are part of the human predicament, the human experience. But again, listen to me. Feelings are not the greatest measure of reality. The truth is that, like the woman in the parable, God is concerned for you. God is pursuing you. And you are worth the search no matter how you feel about yourself or Him. Remember, Jesus is painting this picture for them to understand a God who was much more intimately involved with us than any of the impersonal gods that those people would have had, or the impersonal images that they would have had about God. And He wants us to understand the same thing. There is a God in heaven who is always coming after you, always pursuing you, no matter how you feel, no matter how alone or lonely, or how long you have felt untethered from Him, because you are of uppermost value to Him. So don't let your feelings have the final say. The people hearing this story needed to understand this. Some of them felt lost, real close to the presence of God. He was still going to pursue them until they could be found. Jesus affirmed that. So, question I have, a couple questions. Have you let the joy of being lost rob you of the joy of being pursued, or the joy of knowing that you will be found? And have you let your discouragement of your present situation steal your hope for the future? May we be able to resist, though, the temptation to dwell on those things and know that at all times our God is pursuing us. Let's pray. Dear God, however we started this day, there are some that perhaps woke up and today was another day where they just felt not connected as well. more uncertain than before. Watching the news, hearing what's taking place in our world, and feeling like the slippery slope just got more slippery today than it was yesterday, and more so than last week, last month, last year. And I do know this, the enemy is going to want to convince us that our feelings reflect reality. That the sense that that God is not right by our side, that is the truth. And this story tells us that is a lie. So I pray, God, that we might know that your pursuit of us is of highest priority to you. That you might not reveal yourself to us in the time frame that we would prefer, but you never choose to do so unless you have a greater purpose in mind. And oftentimes that's to grow our faith and to deepen our trust. And for us to know, God, that we are valuable to you and always will be, and that will never change. Give us strength for this day. Keep our eyes fixed on you. May we push back on the doubts that the enemy sends our way and hold on to the truth that our God cares and will not give up until we know that we are right in his hands. And I pray this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. I want to thank you for joining us today. God bless you. Have a great week.